Guys, UnoPro here for part 1 of my Denizens of Shim'zar review. Now, the set has been, we've known about it for quite a long time, excuse me, but just now we're starting to really get into the bulk of the spoilers. We had the roundtable a while ago. I'm not covering that one today just because the card images aren't really out, so I might save that one for a later date. But we started having a lot of Twitter reviews and some streamers and YouTube, Mogwai, I think was the only YouTuber, to reveal cards. So we're going to start going over those. This is part 1. I think there's been 10 cards released in that method, and we're getting a couple each day. So we'll break it into parts and hopefully cover the whole expansion. For those of you who have been a little bit out of the loop, it's going to be a pack-based expansion, so you'll buy packs separately from the classic set, and it won't be like an adventure like Hearthstone, which is very, very fortunate. I really do not like the format of Hearthstone adventures, but that's a whole nother thing. So we have a lot to get it through. Let's just get straight into things. Now the first one is Sobru, which is a 3-mana 2/4 that whenever this damages a neutral minion, destroy that minion. Now, my first instinct, to put it bluntly, is this card is pretty garbage. Compare it to the Songhai minion, 3-mana 1/5 that deals damage, and if it deals damage to an enemy, kills it. Even that has seen no play, and that's in a faction with inner focus. And so why would we play this? Well, it's a neutral, so other factions can have it. But is there another faction that really wants this card? And the answer is probably not. You look to factions that don't have hard removal, or good hard removal, which could be something like Abyssian, but you really need a very board-centric deck to not fall behind. And a lot of times it's a 2/4, when you're behind, it gets traded with so easily. This card is just really not that good. People have said maybe you could play it in Kara, but why are you playing it in Kara? You're playing it in Kara so you can buff it up and then it's better. But then the ability is not that relevant if you buffed it up twice. Obviously this card is at its best against Kara, because that's basically the only deck, sometimes Vitruvian as well, that really runs a lot of neutrals at the moment. I mean, this works against Mechazor, but it's really just not that good. I don't think Kara really cares about this card. They can cryo it, they get more general hit. It's just very, very weak. It has no instant effect on the board. It's very, very easy to play around, and this is all considering there's neutral minions. If this was the Songhai effect, it would be strictly better, and it still probably would not be played, in my opinion. So I think this card is pretty terrible, but you'll get 100 spirit for it, and maybe people will find a use for it, but I'm really not expecting it, unless we see some decks pop up that really, really rely on neutral minions. Whereas I think in likelihood what's going to happen is that we're going to shift even further away from neutral minions as more options come out. There'll be more cards available to each faction. I don't think the developers want previous metagames we've had where there's lots of neutral minions, so I can't see this card getting much better, and at first glance it really doesn't look too good. Okay, on to Beastmaster. Now, Beastmaster 2/5/5 with Frenzy and Celerity, so pretty undercosted. It's about 3 mana worth of stats for Frenzy and Celerity. Now, people, when they see this card, their first thought is Songhai, and that's how it often is with Celerity cards or Frenzy cards. We've seen in the past, especially with the 2-card system, 2-card draw system, something like sort of Mechazor was really good at Songhai because you could inner focus and combo with bust spells. Now, when in the 1-card draw system, those kind of combos have gotten a lot less viable because you need 3 cards, and then sure, if you pull it off, it's really good, but it's a lot harder to get to that, and when you do, you run out of cards very, very quickly. And I don't really think this card is that fantastic. Now, when you do that combo, it's really, really good because you attack twice and you clear everything. But what about when you don't have that combo? And that's when this card is really, really bad. It's a 5-mana 2/5. And, that's what Zenrui loves. So if you're not inner focusing it, it's very, very weak to Zenrui. And then you have to consider, is it even better than Scarlet Viper? Well, if you play this and you don't inner focus it, your opponent's going to have a whole turn to react to it. It's very, very easy to play around it. Even with Celerity, it's pretty easy to play around it, and most of you are going to be like attacking once and Celeritying once with base damage. So, like, that's a 2-attack frenzy for 5 mana that your opponent has had a lot of control over. Now, obviously there's a lot of potential still. If this thing lives and you miss Dragon Seal, or you can inner focus it, killing Edge, sure, that's a lot of cards, but when it works, it's very, very strong. That is a lot of mana. So I don't really expect to see this card to see much play at all. The amount of times like I've played a Scarlet Viper and it just never lives or does nothing. This is a very similar card, and I just really don't think it's going to be doing anything. 2-5 is really, really terrible for 5 mana, and it doesn't impact the board when it's played. So if we will see, I'm sure maybe some people will try this card in Songhai, but the problem isn't that it's not good enough when you have Inner Focus, Sabersign Seals. Sometimes it's pretty good then. The problem is when you don't have those 3 cards, and having 3 card combos that taste 6 mana is not an easy thing to do these days, especially in an aggressive deck like Songhai. So I'm really not expecting much like this. As much as I love the old Lantern Fox High, I don't think it's coming back with this card. Alright, on to a card that's probably a little bit better than these two. Sky Phalanx? I'm going to go with Phalanx. Summon 3 Silverguard Knights nearby your general. So just doing some very, very, very like basic way of figuring out the card. Silverguard Knights, 3 mana card, and it's an 8 mana. If you get 3 of them, you're getting 1 more mana in like a theory kind of sense, but it doesn't really work that way, and it's not necessarily worse or better by comparing it to that, because it's all in one card, but you're getting these 3 mana cards in the late game when it's 8 mana. Though I do think this card is very, very good, but it really depends on how Lionheart decks really shape up to be. We've seen probably in the past, especially stages where Arjun has gone really tempo based, some players still believe it's the best route is to go quite aggressive with Lionheart at the moment. So it depends, can Lionheart even get to a stage where it's playing 8 mana cards. I think this will be a very solid 1 of, or potentially a 2 of. I don't think this is a 3 of, even though it's very, very strong. It's an 8 mana card, and 8 mana is absolute ton, especially because for months we just had very, very tempo based metagames. We haven't really had decks that really, really grind out, want to be going into heaps of post 9 mana turns. Though I do think this card is very, very good. There's basically nothing that really answers it. There is Obliterate, which is a card that's been spoiled for Cassiva decks, presumably Shadow Creep decks, that could potentially deal with this, which is a bit of a problem. But apart from that, nothing really answers that. Mercantor doesn't really do much. Like at most, it can damage 2 of them if you're smart about it. And if you're just playing it on an empty board into your opponent's general, then they can actually only damage 1 of it a lot of the time. So that's not really a concern. Holy Immolation doesn't do a ton. There obviously will be ways, but it's also just how impactful are the minions that will be versing. And in other card games, where sometimes 8 mana minions, 9 mana minions are quite prevalent, you may look at a bunch of 3 mana minions and say, well, they don't actually line up very well against these other late game threats. But we're at the point in Duelyst where we really haven't seen a meta where late game creatures have been around and have been commonly played. If you're going into turn 8, very rarely are you going to be playing something into a 7 mana minion. That's just not how the game tends to work. Whereas if there was always these big minions around and you're playing a bunch of 3/5s into some really big minions, that can be a problem. But that's just not the Duelyst that we live in. Oh, we don't live in Duelyst. That's a really weird thing to say. But it's just not the game that we play. We don't really have to worry too much about how our minions line up against other really big minions a lot of the time. So that's not as big of a concern. I think this card is very, very good. It's very hard to deal with, and Lionheart kind of is in a state of snowballing off just having minions stick. You have stuff like Divine Bond, Holy Immolation gets a lot better when you have a minion, and you have Argion's Bloodborne spell, Zvaran's Bloodborne spell, all about having a minion stick. This is a very good way to have a minion stick. So I think this is very good. Has instant effect on the board with 3 provoked minions. I think it's a very good card. I don't expect to see more of a 2 of, though. maybe the card is actually just so insane that you run 3 of them, not because you want to draw 3 of them, but because you want to have 1 by 8 mana. So you want to make sure you have 1 by 8 mana. I think with the replace mechanic there, that's not really necessary. I think a lot of the time you'll have drawn 1 of 2 by the time you get to 8 mana, though I could be wrong on that. So we will see. Though I also do think an 8 mana card in Linar is not actually that bad. And the reason for that is not because Linar really loves going late game, but it's because the rest of the deck really doesn't. It curves out very, very well. You often have heaps of options to curve out. And so having 1 card in hand that you have to replace when you draw it is actually not that big a deal, because you often have lots of different options to curve out. So you're not really relying on getting rid of. You don't really rely on replacing each turn, because you have lots of solid options to curve out regardless a lot of the time. Anyway, that's enough of that one. Definitely expect us to see a good amount of play though. Okay, so Night Fiend. Now, this is, I'm not going to go too deep into this one, just because it's a very synergy-based card, and we don't know the full extent of Shadow Creep support. We do know there's a change to Shadow Creep that is coming in that makes it always deal 1 damage maximum. So it's going to be less about Shadow Nova and more about generating creep and then taking cards that take advantage of that. And this is one of those cards. So deal 2 damage to each enemy on or near friendly Shadow Creep. So basically, for each Shadow Creep, it's kinetic equilibrium size effect, which is actually pretty massive. And if you have multiple Shadow Creep, that gets pretty good pretty quickly. Though it depends, and also, like, it's a 5 mana 3/2. That's really, really bad. I think it's comparable to Frostborn Naga. With obviously less control, your opponent can play around it a little bit easier and nullify it completely. And it really depends. Like, we have Shadow Nova, which curves into this, which is definitely very relevant. You don't want to be. If you have a 5 mana minion with this kind of effect, you really want to be able to curve into it, have it at its best, and obviously when it's late game, it will get really good. I do expect this to see some play though, if Shadow Creep decks actually are popular, just because it makes it really, really awkward. And just having this, the threat of your deck, makes your opponent position really, really awkwardly around it. Though 2 damage really isn't that much, so I think it'll see a little bit of play, but it won't be a staple, or at least it won't be a 3-of. I don't expect it. It's quite situational if you don't get a Shadow Nova off, which can be a very, very slow tempo swing winner. If your opponent positions around it, you come into play, you deal 1 damage to something on turn 4 for 4 mana. Like, that seems really bad. So I don't expect this to see heaps of play, but as a late game option, it's similar to Obliterate. Maybe even just as a tech card against the more swarmy decks. So we will see, but I'm not overly hyped about this card. So Sphere of Darkness. So this is I believe it's the first card we've seen that actually generates creep. There's an additional way to do it. We do know Shadow Nova will be getting changed, but that already generates creep, obviously. So turn a space into Shadow Creep and draw a card. Now, I actually think this card is very, very good. And it's going to be a 3-of in any creep decks. It's a cycle, similar to First Wish, but you don't even need a minion to cycle, which actually can be quite relevant. You turn a space, it's basically deal 1 damage, draw a card, plus Shadow Creep synergies, which is actually really, really good. And even if we just saw, like, the Night Fiend that we just saw, you play this, and then you Night Fiend, you probably would have a Shadow Creep, so that may do something, and then you get like a equilibrium effect, which is actually not too bad. So I think this card is very, very good. It's going to be one of the enablers for a Shadow Creep deck. I think it may even potentially see some play in Abyssian decks that aren't Shadow Creep decks, because 1 mana, deal 1 damage, draw a card, definitely can be pretty good. Obviously, it depends a little bit on the meta, but I'd probably play this over Blood Tier. Like, it definitely depends on the meta. In a very tempo-based meta, or like in Kara, you probably value the 2/1 body a little bit more. But in a lot of decks, especially the more grindy decks, which a lot of Abyssians tend to be, you value a card over 1 damage, right? And this has the added effect of lasting around. It gives you a Shadow Creep, which is very, very relevant. So I think this card is very, very good. I think it's a lot better than Blood Tier. In slower metas, or even more mid-range metas, or basically in non-aggressive decks. slash Kara. So I think this card will see heaps of play, and it's not like overbearing. It's not like Taygeti level of just obnoxious power. It's very, very strong, but you're not going to get 2 souls reversing, which is always nice. So I think this card is very, very good, but we will need to see, because it's a very, very synergistic Shadow Creep deck. We really need to see the other cards. So that's it for this part 1. I will be back with the future parts, revealing all the other cards. Next part, we do have some Songhai cards coming up, which I'm very, very excited about. I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about. If you want to see more of these guys, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.